Spellcasting in Dungeons & Dragons is really weird. It has a lot of complicated, unintuitive, and massively misunderstood rules that ends up leading to a situation where there's probably far more ambiguity than there needs to be at a lot of tables. And of course, I know that if you've been playing for long enough, you probably have a pretty good sense of the rules, and there are things that don't seem complicated to you just because you're used to them, but that doesn't mean that they're designed very well. So what I wanted to look at today are some of the updates or tweaks to spellcasting rules that I would love to see printed in the revised 2024 Player's Handbook, and I think most of these actually have a real chance of happening, but others might need a future edition. Also, this video is not intended as a discussion on the martial-caster divide. I've talked about that in plenty of other videos, so go check them out if you're curious. I'll leave them linked in the end cards. This is really just intended to be a discussion about the current design and implementation of the spellcasting rules in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, how they can be improved, streamlined, or just made more fun. Some changes may have the side effect of making casters even stronger, but honestly, this might be a trade-off I'm willing to make if it makes the game better overall. Spellcaster power can be toned down in plenty of other ways, but again, this just isn't about that. I'm currently trying to hit a goal of 7,000 subscribers by the end of April, so if you like what I do and you want to support me, a sub to the channel would really mean a lot. Huge shout out to all my members, Julian in the Champion tier, Jackal3 and Jumpy Sonic Bear in the Hero tier, and Julio and Siren XY in the Warrior tier. If you'd like to support me for as little as $1 per month and get some shoutouts, members-only content, and early access to new videos, and so much more, click on the join button. Thanks. We're not going to waste any more time here since we have a math lesson to get to a little bit later on in this video, so let's just start with probably the biggest one that I think not only has a real chance of happening, but one that I also want to happen really badly, and that's either the complete removal of or a fundamental change to the bonus action spell rule. The current version of the bonus action spell rule is unnecessarily convoluted. It exists to rein in the power, to some small degree at least, of spellcasters and prevent them from being able to do even more on their turns, but the reality is just that the rule makes things so much more confusing than it needs to be, and doesn't really add enough value to justify the additional complication. If you go ahead and ask 10 people how the bonus action spell rule works, I guarantee you that 9 of them are getting it wrong. The bonus action spell rule can be found in Chapter 10 of the Player's Handbook under the Casting a Spell section. The text reads, Bonus action. A spell cast with your bonus action is especially swift. You must use a bonus action on your turn to cast a spell, provided that you haven't already taken a bonus action this turn. You can't cast another spell during the same turn, except for a cantrip with a casting time of 1 action. The most important section of this is really that last sentence, and all it's telling you is that if you use your bonus action to cast a spell, the only other spell that you can cast is a cantrip that costs 1 action. So for example, if you cast Misty Step during your turn, that being a spell that costs a bonus action, you can still cast another spell in the same turn. It just has to be a cantrip that has a casting time of 1 action. So many people misinterpret or misunderstand this rule to the point that it's often recited as you can't cast more than 1 spell per turn, or that you can't cast more than 1 leveled spell per turn. Both of these interpretations are incorrect. You can absolutely cast more than 1 spell per turn. The rule itself has that baked into it. And you can absolutely cast more than 1 leveled spell per turn in multiple ways, such as through the use of Action Surge or even Counterspell. The big thing about this rule that makes it so frustrating to deal with, besides the misinterpretations, is that it creates some insane scenarios that just defy any and all logic. For example, if you cast Fireball on your turn and an enemy casts Counterspell, you can absolutely cast Counterspell to counter their Counterspell. It's a mouthful, but it works, and it's accurate, I promise. However, if you use your bonus action to cast Misty Step, a spell that the rule itself describes as being especially swift, and it gets counterspelled for some reason, you actually can't counterspell that if you wanted to, since counterspell is 1, not a cantrip, and 2, it costs a reaction, not an action. It's stupid, and it makes no sense. Why even describe it as being especially swift when it isn't? My solution here isn't really anything novel, just get rid of the rule. Let people cast bonus action spells and action spells regardless of whether or not they are cantrips or leveled spells. Is this going to make casters potentially stronger? Yeah, probably, but this video isn't about that, remember? What it does do though is create some more open-ended room for creativity with casting. This is pretty much exactly how it's also done in Baldur's Gate 3, and while yes, that's a video game and functions a little bit differently, it honestly just feels so freeing. The second thing it does is also open up a bit more design space to allow for some more bonus action cantrips, because right now there are exactly 2, Magic Stone and Shillelagh. As an aside, it's wild to me that the only 2 bonus action cantrips we have had in the game came out 10 years ago. No new ones have been released in any of the 40 some odd books over the last decade. The second possible solution is to just allow one leveled spell and one cantrip per turn, irrespective of which one was cast as the bonus action or the main action. This version would pretty much necessitate the inclusion of more bonus action cantrips though. Next up, I want to talk about targeting because it gets a bit sketchy at times. Let's say a monster is sitting inside a wall of force shaped like a dome. You're standing 10 feet away and want to cast Magic Missile against them. Magic Missile merely requires that you can see the creature and that they're within range. Both of these check out, so can you cast Magic Missile on the monster inside the wall of force? I think most people would correctly state that no, the spell won't work against the monster, but I would bet that most wouldn't get it for the quote-unquote correct reason. The description of Wall of Force explicitly states that nothing can physically pass through the wall. Alright, this then raises the question of what exactly constitutes a Magic Missile, and does it have some kind of physicality? Well, fortunately, the Magic Missile spell sort of answers this for us, and when I say sort of, I mean because it doesn't really. It describes the darts as darts of magical force. Great. I don't know what that is. There's no real life analog for that. Does something made of magical force have a physical form? I don't know, whatever. It doesn't really matter, because the answer is that you can't cast Magic Missile on a monster inside Wall of Force, because Wall of Force apparently creates an area of full cover. This, while it might seem like it makes total sense, is actually shockingly inconsistent. Firstly, there's some ambiguity about what exactly total cover means. The definition states that a target has total cover if it is completely concealed by an obstacle. Now, the ordinary meaning of concealed, which most would interpret as hidden or unable to be seen, is not the definition used in the game, which adds more layers to the confusion. In the context of 5th edition, concealed simply means any solid obstacle, regardless of material. So the Wall of Force prevents the missiles from hitting it because it provides total cover, which in order to fully understand the definition of, you need to unearth a tweet from Jeremy Crawford from April of 2017. Give me a break. Especially so when he so consistently reiterates that spells do what they say and nothing else. Like this tweet from August 2017, which reads, "The dual wielder feat doesn't include the benefit of the 2-weapon fighting feature. It would say so if it did." Or this one from June of 2016, which reads, "If the grease spell created a flammable substance, the spell would say so. It doesn't say so." But Wall of Force doesn't say that it creates total cover. It's just implied through some ambiguous wording, and you just have to innately understand their definition of the word conceal. It's also worth mentioning that in this scenario, the Wall of Force doesn't even need to be shaped like a dome. It can be using the paneled walls as well. And the thing is, sure, maybe this makes sense for Wall of Force. It's a 5th level spell, it's powerful, I get it. But this exact same interaction actually applies to just a literal closed window. I'm not going to say that the rule itself needs to change. Honestly, take it or leave it. But what I am saying is that the definition needs to be made a lot more clear in the text, so people don't need to reference a 7-year-old tweet to play the game. And since I know that people are going to say that they don't take Jeremy Crawford's rulings on Twitter as official, the reality is he is the lead designer for the game. The logic he's using in these tweets, however unhinged they might be, is the same logic that he uses when working with the team to create the rules in the first place, so I do actually tend to view them as official. Kind of tangentially related, something I saw brought up on Reddit maybe a month ago or so was the idea of adding a new spell component for Eyesight and labeling it as E. It's honestly a really cool idea and should inherently include the definition of that you can see and is not behind total cover. It would decrease some text and spells, potentially making them both easier to write and to interpret, and solve some occasional questions that pop up about this. I don't really expect this change, but I would love to see it. Since we're on the topic of spell components, another one that gets brought up a lot, and I've actually never talked about it in any of my videos, is the ridiculously convoluted way that material and somatic components are handled in the game. The more research I did into this area, the more I realized that there are some wildly divergent schools of thoughts on the topic. The amount of people I came across on Reddit and other forums saying that they just ignore components completely because they're just flavor, or they bog down the game, was pretty staggering. There's also the other side that argues that they're pretty important for the game, even if they add some wrinkles and spell focuses largely fill in most of the gaps anyway. If you're unfamiliar with the rules relating to casting spells that have both material and somatic components, allow me to ruin your day. I don't think I can really summarize it better than it was already done in Sage Advice, so I'm just gonna quote it. If a spell has a somatic component, you can use the hand that performs the somatic component to also handle the material component. For example, a wizard who uses an orb as a spellcasting focus could hold a quarterstaff in one hand and the orb in the other, and he could cast Lightning Bolt, by using the orb as the spell's material component and the orb hand to perform the spell's somatic component. Another example, a cleric's holy symbol is emblazoned on her shield. She likes to wade into melee combat with a mace in one hand and a shield in the other. She uses the holy symbol as her spellcasting focus, so she needs to have the shield in hand when she casts a cleric spell that has a material component. If the spell, such as Aid, has a somatic component, she can perform that component with the shield hand and keep holding the mace in the other. If that same cleric casts Cure Wounds, she needs to put the mace or the shield away, because that spell doesn't have a material component, but does have a somatic component. She's going to need a free hand to make the spell's gesture. If she had the Warcaster feat, she could ignore this restriction. For added clarity, yes, this is saying that if you cast a spell with both a material and a somatic component, you can use the same hand to perform both the gesture and provide your focus. However, if you're casting a spell that only has a somatic component, you now need to drop one of those items so that you can free up a hand. That same one that was perfectly capable of gesturing while holding the focus now can't, for reasons. And I get it. The component rules exist again to provide a framework for how and when a caster can cast a spell. When it's perceivable, when they are expensive and require consumed items, it also provides some added depth in creating systems where special features or abilities can bypass these requirements, like a sorcerer's metamagic options. I understand why they exist, but the way this rule functionally works in practice is crazy. If run is written, it requires a ridiculous amount of weapon dropping or storing, and it's just kind of obnoxious. Given all the reading and research I did, I get the sense that most people are running this at their tables kind of the same way that I do at mine, which is to say that if there's no material component, I just don't require the caster to drop an item to perform that somatic component. They're clearly capable of doing it with their hand. I just make sure that they know that maybe it's a little bit more obvious what they're doing. I can't help but feel like this should just kind of be the rule. Kind of like the bonus action spell rule above, the added complication this brings to the game, I really don't feel is justified by whatever benefit is accompanying it. The next rule I wanted to talk about isn't so much a change as it is a clarification or standardization. Let's get philosophical. Are circles squares? This might seem like a really silly question, but I promise it can actually have some significant impacts on the mechanics of spellcasting overall. If you saw my 1D&D one-shot, you may have noticed that this is how we opted to run our spells, which definitely rubs some people the wrong way, but I think it's worth diving into to explain the logic and that we didn't just make this rule up. First of all, Tree and Monk actually has a more detailed video on this specific topic from like 3 years ago. I'll leave a link in the description and I strongly recommend checking it out if you want a little bit more in-depth information on it. Alright, so are circles squares? The answer is yes, sometimes. Let's look at a practical example to explain. Fireball creates a spherical blast in a 20-foot radius in all directions. The problem is that when playing on a grid and you draw the sphere on a flat plane, you end up with the circle, and then in order to comply with Dungeons & Dragons rules, every square, even when counting diagonally, is counted as 5 feet. Now, the player's handbook mentions that this method of counting sacrifices realism for the sake of more efficient play, and I'm totally here for that, don't get me wrong. So with that in mind, let's then get back to our example. What happens when you count diagonals as 5 feet is that now, not all the points on the circle are 20 feet away from its center, which means that our fireball spell will not satisfy the requirements of the spell. You can see this on this really crude representation that the pink dots are only 15 feet away from the center of the circle. However, that's still the limit of our apparently 20-foot fireball. In order to have all the points equal 20 feet from the center, we would need to hit those green dots. But to do that, we couldn't extend the circle because then it would get too big. So in order to have all the points extend to that 20-foot range from the center and to connect all of the green dots, we actually need to draw a square. This is where the logic of circles or squares comes from. So for all of you who were really upset in like grade 9 math or whatever when you were learning Pythagoras and complain that you would never use it, this is your chance to use it. The reason this happens is because 5th edition's method of counting diagonals ignores Pythagoras. If you do the actual geometry, the diagonals are about 7 feet across, which makes the distance of those 3 squares, the ones that we counted before as 15 feet, actually be about 20 feet. So at this point, it is worth mentioning that in the Dungeon Master's Guide, there is guidance for counting diagonals in a more realistic way, which essentially amounts to counting every second diagonal as 10 feet. So you would count those same 3 squares as 5 feet plus 10 feet plus 5 feet, which again lets you arrive at the pink dots, counting it as 20 feet. The big reason this comes up is because we like to mix and match our preference for more efficient play in counting every square as 5 feet because it's easier, with our equal desire to see a realistic number, and the reality is that those two things just don't align very well. So what's the answer to all this? I'm honestly not totally sure. I think the DMG or the player's handbook could probably be a bit more clear about why this discrepancy exists for everyone, rather than just saying it sacrifices realism. Perhaps they could also include the circles are squares variant as a suggestion if you are not using the diagonals variant rule. My understanding is that previous editions and even Pathfinder already use the diagonal counting rule, so it's not like it's unheard of, but it would certainly be a change for 5e. Alright, that was a lot. Everything I've talked about here, I think, are some of the major choke points that are affecting spellcasting and preventing it from being more efficiently designed. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here, I'm just trying to share some thoughts and have a discussion about these things, and I'm really curious about what you all think and what other elements of spellcasting you'd like to see updated in the game. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, consider subscribing to help me reach that goal of 7,000 subscribers by the end of April. Check out some of my other D&D videos, but otherwise, take care.